أنفض الحزن المعشعش في الجدار ومررت أمسي على الديار أنفض الحزن المعشعش في الجدار وأقبل الأرض التي وطئت صغار.
My name is Heather Spears. Recently I went to the occupied territories to draw the children who are involved in the struggle for self-determination, which is called the Intifada. These are some of the drawings that I made there. This is Marwan, one of the first children that I drew. He's 14 years old, and as I was drawing, you can see that I had to erase part of his hair. This is because he suddenly put his hand up, and he did this to show me in the only way that he could that the bullet was still in his head, because he was mute at the time because of his injury. His cousin wrote this on the drawing. Marwan was outside eating a piece of bread, and the street was quiet. Suddenly he was surprised by the soldiers and ran back towards the house, and they shot at him, injuring him in the head, and he fell down to the ground 50 meters from the house. We called the hospital, and he was taken to Jerusalem, and now he can't move his hand and leg on his right side, and he can't talk, and the bullet is still in his head after 1 month. We will not kneel down as long as we have a child taking milk from the breast. Revolution to victory. This is one of the first drawings that I made of Marwan. You can see he has a Quran on his pillow, the Islamic Bible. They did get the bullet out of his head after 2.5 months. They used a magnetic rod, and he's about the first child that they were able to save in this way. The bullet had already crossed his brain at that time. And when I made this drawing, I thought he was unconscious, but he actually knew that I was there. And as I was drawing him, he lifted up his hand in the salute that became very, very familiar to me. This is a drawing I did later of Marwan when he was feeling a little better, and it's with his little cousin Ayad, who was always in the hospital, running errands, looking after him. And I put it in just to show the kind of admiration that these children have for their injured comrades that amounts almost to hero worship. I don't know very much about this boy. I drew him in Makassar Hospital in East Jerusalem, and all I know is that he was shot in the leg and his leg had to be amputated. This is one of the few children that really were very traumatized that I drew. He wouldn't talk to anyone, he wouldn't smile, but he did let me draw him, and a nurse rolled him over and showed me a bullet hole in the middle of his spine, and he was paralyzed from there down. But remember him because he comes back into the story a little later. He's 15 years old. These are some drawings that I drew in the operating room of Makassar Hospital. I was leaving one evening and a doctor found me on the stairs and took me by the arm and said, "You have to come in and draw this child that's been brought in from Nablus." And by the time I had a gown on and a mask and was ready to draw, they'd already finished shaving off all her beautiful hair. It was all lying on the floor. She'd been shot in the middle of the forehead with one of these bullets that are called rubber bullets, PCMBs, and the drawings are pictures of the removal of this bullet. They're actually solid metal marbles, and they make a hole about the size of a quarter. They have a skin of rubber. when the bullet was removed, the doctor took it in his hand and gave it to me, put it right into my hand, and he said, take this bullet and show it to everybody that is going to see your exhibition, to show what's being done to our kids. But it wasn't sent out with my drawings, and another one was given to me in Vienna, but it was taken away from me at Kennedy Airport. This is after the operation. They're putting a bandage on her forehead. And here's Amina just after the operation. She did very well. I went back and drew her the next day in the hospital, and she was already feeling a little better. A doctor wrote on one of the drawings, Amina is 12 years old. She was injured by a rubber bullet in her head while she was trying to bring her little brother in from the street. She was operated on to remove the bullet from her forehead, and her condition is excellent. And here she is less than a week later, and she was up and around. The stitches almost look like Arabic writing on her forehead. This is the hand of a 19-year-old whose name is Ripe from Nablus, and I couldn't see much more than his hand on the intensive care ward, so I just drew his hand. He'd been shot while he was standing on a roof, and he fell off the roof on his head, and he was in a coma. One of his brothers wrote this on the drawing. He was shot from a distance of 6 meters, and after that he fell down 2 stories, which caused a fractured skull and brain injury. This happened in the old city of Nablus, and on that same day there were no incidents of stone throwing. Nablus, the mountain of fire. And that's what they called their very revolutionary city, the mountain of fire. This is a picture of him with one of his brothers, and his brother's trying to wake him up from the coma and saying to him, "Do you know me, Ripe? Do you know me?" And he did wake up after about 2.5 weeks. And these are some pictures of him when he'd woken up. But he always had that very frightened expression in his eyes, and he would only whisper. And he kept turning away. This is one of the many children that I drew who were shot in the abdomen. He's about to have an exploratory operation, so he has this antiseptic soap on his belly. And I was very nervous during this operation because I kept expecting them to take the bullet out. But I was told afterwards it had gone right through him and gone out the other side, so I didn't see it. And the operation was just to check that nothing vital had been hit. And he was all right, he was lucky, and they were able to sew him up again. And here he is the next day on the ward. His name's Naif. The way I was working was the way I always work in very private situations. I got permission. If it was in the hospitals, I got permission from the staff and from the families, from the children. And I made photocopies either the very same day that I did the drawings or the next morning, and made sure that the families got them. So they always knew what I was doing. They approved of it and what I wanted to do with the drawings. To be a witness. This isn't a child, this is an adult. I didn't even want to look at him, let alone draw him, but his family kept begging me to draw him, and finally they told me that he has 13 children. So I made a kind of bargain that if I drew him, they'd let me go home and draw all his 13 children, and they said I could. So then I drew him. I asked his brother to write a story on the drawing, and he wrote very slowly his whole story. And he wrote it as though this man, whose name is Akram, had written it himself. And this is what it says. I am Akram Sadiq Barbak of the people of Khan Yunis in Gaza. I'm 43 years old, and I have 13 children, all of them still young. On the 26th of November, I was sitting in my electrical shop when the Israeli soldiers came. They told me to extinguish a burning car tower while it was burning. So I told them to be patient till I could bring some water and some sand. So they told me, extinguish it with your hands and your feet. So I said to them, this is not fair, but they said you have to, and they insisted. Then they took me to a hidden street, and there were 8 of them, and they started to beat me in a terrible way with their sticks and the butts of their rifles on every part of my body. Then they hit me against the wall and on the asphalt of the road. My wife knew about it, and she came and started pleading with them, it's not fair. So they beat her also, and 2 of my daughters, and my older brother. They beat me till I was unconscious in all my senses. I can't talk, I can't hear, I can't move, I can't feel. I'm just an object. I lie on a bed and I feel nothing. I am Akram Sadiq Barbak of the people of Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is a picture of his brother feeding him with a tube. And his brother stayed in the hospital those 3 months and took care of him. He didn't think that was anything special. This is a picture of him with his brother holding him. And I did go home to Gaza with Akram when he was sent home in the Red Crescent ambulance. And the other patient in the Red Crescent ambulance was the boy who had been shot in the spine. And they were both being sent home to Gaza. And on the way, the ambulance driver suddenly stopped beside a little house in the country and carried these 2 patients down into a house and put them on the floor. And it was the home of a Bedouin doctor. And he treated them there. And these are some sketches from his treatment. He was very strange. He made very strange noises over them and blew in their faces and pulled at their limbs. And every once in a while he'd stand up and talk to the ambulance drivers in a very ordinary way, and you could tell that they respected him and they knew him well. His wife came in with a frying pan full of burning coal that had a very pungent smoke that he blew into their faces. And then one of the ambulance drivers nudged me and said, look at the boy, and he was grinning, and he was wiggling the toes of his right foot. And when I told this back at the hospital, the staff said, no, it's not possible, but the director of the hospital said, yes, it is, and there's some American doctors studying the Bedouin methods now. So anyway, he went home with some hope, even though he didn't have a wheelchair. And we drove on into Gaza, and I'm sure you've all seen films and pictures of what the camps are like. It was very, very crowded. And Akram was carried upstairs into his house and put on a couch. And his immediate family was there, many of his extended family, and many visitors. It was so crowded I could hardly move my elbow, but I did draw while I was there. This is a picture of Akram on the couch with his mother beside him. I stayed with this family and I drew all 13 children and several cousins that told me they were his children because they wanted me to draw them. This is Iman, one of his daughters. And another of his daughters. She has the Palestinian colors braided into her hair, and she wanted me to color them in the drawing. Green, red, black, and white. If she'd been seen by soldiers wearing these colors in that combination, she could have been beaten or arrested because it's prohibited. Here's some of the children asleep on mats on the floor. This is Nawal, the oldest daughter, and she corresponds with me now, and she tells me that her father is in a very good hospital in Saudi Arabia, and he's conscious and he's able to hear and see and speak. And when they get the casts off his legs, they're going to teach him to walk. They hope. None of this family speaks English, so she writes to me in Arabic, and I can just read her letters with a dictionary and write back to her. This is the youngest son. His name's Ahmed. And this is the baby Rana. She was born about 4 days after her father was beaten up, and she was about 3 months old when I drew her. This is a very famous boy. His name's Muhammad Abu Akr, and he was 16 when I drew him. He writes his own story on the drawing, very beautifully, filling up the spaces of the drawing. I was shot the 6th of August by the Israeli soldiers, and they meant to kill me. I was on my way to my cousin's house, and the women of the camp saved me, and I was carried to the hospital in Bethlehem, and then to Makassad in Jerusalem. I was operated on. In the beginning, they removed 40% of my intestines, and after 2 weeks as I was bleeding, I had another operation, and they cut the rest of my intestines away, and my condition was critical. So I was flown to America to be given a transplant. It's very difficult to stay alive without any intestines, but with a strong will I have saved myself by myself. They could not make the operation in America, as it would have been the first of its kind in history, so now I'm living by getting nourishment through my veins. And he came home with a machine, and it's hooked up to his chest 12 hours a day, and this is how he receives nourishment to live. And he was living in the camp quite well, but he had to go back into the hospital in East Jerusalem to get his gallbladder out. This is quite a common complication, and while he was there, the day after the operation, this is the hyperalimentation machine that he's on. But the day after the operation, the soldiers entered the hospital and took him hostage, and they kept him for 3 hours, and they said they would just keep him until his brother Nidal gave himself up. So his brother gave himself up. And they've also been to Muhammad Abu Akr's house in the camp, and again used him as a hostage to get other children to give themselves up. So now he can't live at home, he's living in Bethlehem. I talked to his doctor in Boston, and he tells me that Muhammad Abu Akr has a fair chance to live if he can just hang on another couple of years, because they're just on the verge of being able to do this very difficult transplant. This boy just writes, I was shot February the 11th. I hope I'll soon recover, I and all the other injured ones. And I met him recently in Toronto. He'd been brought over to have a very delicate operation on his foot because the nerves were destroyed in one of his feet. And they put a live nerve from one foot into the other foot, and it's going to grow an inch a month, and he's going to get the feeling back in his foot. His name is Yasser, and he told me about some of the other boys that I drew on that ward and how they were doing. And among them was Ahmed. I asked him to write what happened to him on the drawing, and instead he just wrote a couple of lines of a very famous poem. And it says, if you would be a man, make your body a bridge and say to your comrades, come and pass. This is a picture of him that he wanted me to draw with the physiotherapist, and he wanted me to show how he could lift his foot. He got his foot up for about 2 seconds. It cost him a terrific effort. And I learned later on that what had happened to him was he'd been beaten on the nape of the neck, and this is what caused this permanent disability. This boy was always reading whenever I went in. He was reading Shakespeare and philosophy and English. He'd been in jail for almost a year, and he hadn't had any books at all. And he wrote a lot of things on the drawing, proverbs and poetry and so on. I'll just read some of it. O my people, I'm here and not bowed down. My body is broken, but not my will. I'm carrying my spirit in the palm of my hand, ready to throw it into the face of death. I was shot by many bullets, dum-dums in my right leg, by the occupying soldiers, in my beloved heroic village, Ithna al-Halil. In spirit and by blood, we sacrifice to you, Palestine. And then he writes Revolution to Victory. This is a drawing I like very much, I think because of the tension between the extreme weakness and the extreme strength of this man. He's too weak to sit up, and he's too weak even to lift his hand in the salute. It comes out towards me in the drawing. And yet you can see in his face that he's very strong. He's from a Shati camp. This is a 17-year-old whose name is Saeed. I don't know very much about him except that he was hit by a military jeep when he was walking in Gaza town, and he's paralyzed from the neck down, but it was just as if he had a very ruddy, healthy head, and it was almost as if his head hadn't realized what had happened to his body yet. But his body was all wasted away. This is one of his family feeding him, and he's still in the hospital. This is a high school girl called Rana up in Nablus, and when I visited her in the hospital, her little brother was there and he did all the coloring on the drawing. And I asked her to write her story on the drawing, and a boy that was visiting her dictated every single word, and she meekly wrote it down. But she writes that there was a big student demonstration, and these demonstrations are forbidden, and the army moved in, and it became violent, and the soldiers began to shoot, and many of the students were shot. Many of them were girls, and she was one of them. She got shot in the foot, and she's had a couple of operations. So I had to draw her friend Halil too, and he wrote down everything that happened to him. On the 21st July 1988, when there was a big student demonstration, I was shot with 3 rubber bullets, and on the 15th September I was shot in the left leg, and on the 23rd November I was shot in the right hip. Most of my injuries occurred during demonstrations, and I've also been beaten unconscious twice. I think you'll see as we go along that the children and young people that were involved in any kind of clash, they certainly told me about it because they were very proud of it. But statistically, 45% of the deliberate wounding and killing of children occurs outside anything you could call a clash. This is the last drawing of the older kids that I'm going to show you. Her name is Fida, and she was 17, and she has her hand on her shoulder just where she'd been shot. And she whispered with her sister a long time about what they should write, and finally this is what they came up with. From one of the flowers of the Palestinian Revolution, to everyone who loves freedom and independence, with my wishes that the injustice will cease and the occupation be over in our beloved homeland, Palestine. I say this with a loud voice: shoot your bullets, because I'm not afraid of the fire, and I'll throw your bullets back at you as stones. And we have to remember that the Palestinians are armed, but they're disciplined enough not to use these arms against the Israeli military. These drawings were made in the military court, and I was in there several times in East Jerusalem, but every time I went in to draw I was thrown out, so I didn't get very much drawing done. These are 3 boys behind the guard. They're 14 to 16 years old, and they've been brought up from the jail downstairs to have their trial date set, and they were brought in with chains in between their ankles and handcuffed to the guard, and he undid the handcuffs and they sat down. This boy's looking for his parents in the courtroom. These boys have been accused of throwing stones, and the lawyer that was defending them is an Israeli. There are some wonderful Israeli lawyers defending these children, but he told me he can't get them off. There's no way that they're going to be released. They'll be convicted, and they'll get 1.5 to 2 years for stone throwing. 10,000 children have been in jail long enough to be counted since the beginning of the uprising. And when they go to jail, the parents aren't told. They just have to go and try to find them. This is the judge that kept throwing me out. He didn't realize I got a drawing of him first. This is a little boy in a mountain town called Tubas up in the West Bank. His name's Said. He looks as if he's about 7 or 8 years old, and he was wandering around singing revolutionary songs with his friends, and I drew him because he had the homemade slingshot. At that time, all the schools in the West Bank had been totally closed, and the kindergartens, for security reasons, for 14 months. And all teaching of the children was prohibited and made a criminal act. And the schools remained closed for 18 months altogether. And as you know, the universities, colleges, even desperately needed colleges of nursing are still totally closed. The schools are said to be open, but the average Palestinian child last year got 2.5 months out of 12 months schooling. This is a little boy called Shadi. I drew him in the Nablus hospital. He was wandering around selling beans out of a pail, and he wrote his own story on the drawing. While I was selling the turmus, I entered the camp, but the soldiers were behind me, and one called me, and I ran away. So he followed me and began to shoot bullets, and then they took me to prison, and I was home again at 8 at night. Thank you. The name is Shadi. This is a shepherd boy. His name's Anwar. He was very badly hurt. His parents were there and wanted me to draw him, and they wrote his story for him on the drawing. My cousin and I were with the sheep in the mountains when a jeep passed close to us, and they threw a bomb towards us, and it exploded near us, and I was injured in both legs. The bones were broken and the muscles of my right leg, and there are some shards in my eye. Also, my right testicle was removed. And they showed me his leg, and I thought they'll never be able to save it, but they did. I talked to his doctor in Vienna later, and he told me that they saved his leg, and he's walking today. He's totally blind in one eye, and he has about 40% of the vision in his other eye. And Anwar was 13 when this happened, and I read in a report that his 8-year-old cousin Talal, who was also hit by this bomb, was totally blinded immediately and died after 4 days. I also read in a report that the soldiers went right into the hospital and demanded all the little bits of the bomb that were taken out of these boys. And when they saw his leg, they told the doctors to amputate it, but the doctors didn't, and they saved his leg. There was a lot of bombing of the children at that time in the West Bank, but this has all been stopped. These are some drawings that I made in a little Anglican hospital in Gaza town called Achli Arab Hospital, and the operating room was going 24 hours a day when there was a surgeon. And this particular operation is of a little boy who was shot with live ammunition in the thigh, and it severed the main artery in his leg. And the operation was to repair the artery. The lights all went out during this operation, but they did come on again. This is a picture of the anesthetist taking care manually that the little boy stays under the anesthetic. I really like doing these drawings of people taking care of each other. It's a very, very beautiful theme. It's very connected, very concentrated. And they did get the artery put together again. They had to shorten it quite a bit. It was very delicate. And afterwards, they had to remove the bullet. It took about 5 minutes. It was really awful. It was an American doctor doing the operation, and he said, as he was doing this, he said, "This is torture." And there's the bullet down on the right. And these plastic bullets, if they're shot at close range, they tend to work just like high velocity live ammunition. And they explode on impact. And they have a similar effect. And this explosion tends to create vacuum and shatter organs. But Ackley Hospital was a safe place at that time for the children. It's an Anglican hospital, it's not Israeli territory, and they have a very tough administrator, and he was able to keep the children out of the soldiers out of the hospital. But I met him in Vienna last summer, and he told me he can't keep the soldiers out anymore. They come right in after the children. They come right onto the wards. This is Mohammed the next day. When I was holding a stone in my hand to throw it at the Israeli soldiers, one of the soldiers shot me with a bullet and tried to arrest me. I'm 11 years old and was shot in the right leg, but I could escape, and I reached the hospital. And then I was treated there. Now I'm getting better, and after that I will continue in the resistance. These are some of the other children in Ackley Hospital at that time that had been shot in the abdomen. But now the hospital isn't any safer than any of the other hospitals in the territory. The soldiers enter at will. They even use tear gas in the operating room. They beat the staff as the staff try to resist them. And they beat the children and take them. This is Ayman in Makassar Hospital. And he writes, "I was walking in the street and I was shot by one of the soldiers. I've been in the hospital for 5 months. I'm 14 years old. And he was lying on under a kind of tent. He'd had some operations on his leg, and I asked Yasser how he's doing, and he told me he had to have his leg amputated. This is a drawing made in a little government hospital in Khan Yunis. You can see the Hebrew writing on the sheet. And I was taken just onto the ward by a Palestinian doctor, and there was a lot of argument among the visitors whether I should be there or not. This boy was sitting quietly up by the window, and his mother wanted me to draw him. He'd been beaten. And once I started to draw, it was all right. And when I was finished, one of his friends grabbed the drawing and wrote on it. And this is what he wrote: "From a stone we will learn to be hard. From an olive tree we will learn patience. From a dove we will learn peace. And to teach us depth, there's a very deep valley." This is a little girl I was drawing up in the Nablus hospital when they came to take her in for an operation, so I went with them and drew the operation. I was drawing on big brown envelopes and using a 6B pencil and just my thumb with some spit on it for the tone. And some blackboard chalk for the whites. And just a little bit of color. I thought I was going to use a lot of color, but I found that it slowed me down. The doctor didn't like the drawings I made of him. He thought I made him too fat. But everybody else thought that they looked just like him. Actually, the hospital staffs were very, very generous and helpful to me. They really enjoyed being drawn while they were working, and they were very interested in what I was doing. This is the end of the operation. He's just lifting up her leg to tie the bandage around it, and that's the anesthetist's hand on her hair. And here's little Fanny the next day. She dictated this to her mother. I was home when the children started to throw stones at the occupying soldiers. So I went downstairs to call my brother in from the street. And he was throwing stones, and I was calling him, and then the soldiers started to aim, and I was shot in the leg, then taken to a clinic and treated there, and then moved to hospital. Her name is Fanny. This is Adil. He was very badly wounded with a bullet, and they had to take out one of his kidneys and his spleen. But this last drawing I did of him, I think you can see that he was feeling better. And he knew that he was going to live. This is an 8-year-old called Waleed, drawn in the Ahli hospital. His mother wrote this for him. I had stones in my hand ready to throw at the Israeli soldiers, and they started to chase me in the street. And when they failed to catch me, they shot at me with a bullet, a dum-dum, which injured my right leg. Then I was carried to the hospital and treated, and I'm all right now. Revolution to victory. This little boy was leaning against his mother's knee when I drew him. You can see the little flag she's made him. And a nurse wrote this on the drawing. While there was some fighting between the soldiers and the children, Samar, this little child of 5 years old, was outside his house, and an Israeli soldier hit him very hard on the head with his rifle, so it fractured his skull. And he recovered, I read in one of the reports. This is Salim in government hospital in Khan Yunis camp. His father wrote this. On February 10th, the Israeli soldiers were chasing children in the street, and he was in the street, and they took him and beat him with their sticks. He is 10 years old. At the beginning of the Intifada, they were using wooden truncheons to do this, and they found that they would break and hurt their hands. So now they use plastic truncheons with a metal core. And his father pulled his pants down and showed me he'd been beaten right on the genitals. This is a little boy in Makassar who was shot and had one of these bullets wedged between his ribs. I saw it in the x-ray, and they were waiting for it to move so they could get it out. He was very uncomfortable. He didn't have a flag, but he drew one anyway. And he writes on the drawing, I drew the flag. He's 11 years old. When I was leaving the school, I was shot in the stomach. Palestine, all the newspapers of the world are speaking of you. You are the flower of the spring. Fathi, 11 years old. And this is the last of this series of this younger children. His name's Nabil. He was sitting at home after returning from school, and his mother had made lunch for him and his brothers, and suddenly the soldiers were in the house and began to ask him, "Where have you been?" and started to beat him on his hands, and told him that, "You throw stones with this hand, and I will break it for you." And his mother started to cry. And I learned very soon after I got there that there's no safe place for these children. There's no front line. The children are everywhere, the soldiers are everywhere, and the children can be hurt in the schools, in the hospitals, in their homes in front of their parents. And their parents can't protect them. 31 children have died of tear gas inhalation, tear gas that's been lobbed inside buildings where it isn't supposed to be used at all. and it's a very lethal tear gas that's used in. This is Issam, a little boy up in the mountains of Taysir. I drew him in the Nablus hospital. This child was injured while playing with other children in his village Taysir when a helicopter was flying around, and it then threw a strange object out, and it was a bomb. So Sammy and other children were injured. The children of our people are not allowed to play. Help the boys. You can see help the boys is written in English at the end of this. This little boy wasn't so badly hurt, just in his knee, but his little sister, 5-year-old Iktimal, was hit in the head, and she was brain dead immediately. And she died in Jerusalem about the same time as I was doing this drawing. And because of this, it was very, very tense in the whole area. And they were going to impose a curfew. So I went back to Jerusalem that evening before the curfew was imposed, and I went to look for her because I wanted to draw her for her parents. And her body hadn't been released. And this was to prevent a large funeral, which might turn into a large demonstration. And I found her in the morgue. A male nurse took me down and I was allowed to draw her, but he was quite impatient. It was the middle of the night by this time. It was the end of his shift and he wanted to go home, but he did let me draw her. And this is the little shroud that she was wrapped in. And he undid the shroud so I could see her face. You can see she has a piece of linen around her chin to hold her chin in place. I was at a conference sponsored by the United Nations in Ottawa in November, where Israelis and prominent PLO representatives and Palestinian Canadians and Arab Canadians and Jewish Canadians got together to talk about peace. And the Palestinian came up to me and said, "Do you know what her name Iktimal means?" And I said, "No." And he said, "It means completed or made perfect." These last drawings that I'm going to show you are all of one boy. His name's Suhaib Abu Ghosh, and he is also very well known. He was shot with live ammunition inside the city of Jerusalem. And this is forbidden, and the border guards, the military, simply deny shooting him. They say he fell off a low wall. The wall was 130 centimeters high, and the blood on the road was 4 meters from it. 2 witnesses ran to help him, and they were shot at too. And he was left in the road for 30 minutes before he was taken away. An Israeli doctor confirmed that there was shards of live ammunition in his head. But even so, the military won't reopen the case. He was in a coma for 4 weeks, and I did many drawings of him. I thought that when you were in a coma you just lay there like a vegetable, but it wasn't like that at all. He was shot in the right hemisphere of his brain, and the whole left side of his body became paralyzed and always will be paralyzed. But his right side was very active. You see, they had to tie his hand down because he kept pulling his tubes out. And this is the expression that he had when he was in the coma. And they couldn't keep blankets on him. He'd keep rolling himself up in his sheets. One of the nurses looked at this and said, "That's a drawing of despair." This is a picture with the neurologist getting Suhaib to hold his hand, and he's shouting at him, "Squeeze my hand." He's trying to get him to respond. And this is a picture of Suhaib's hand. His family were almost always beside him. These are his father's hands holding his hand. Suhaib's father is the principal of a high school in East Jerusalem, and he has many Israeli friends, and they were also very grieved about Suhaib and visited him. And Suhaib's story was in all the Israeli papers, and after it was printed in the Israeli papers, then it could be copied in the Palestinian papers, because they're totally censored. There's another picture of him with his father. They're not allowed to write anything about the uprising unless they take it out of an uncensored paper. Here's his grandmother with him. And Suhaib woke up quite suddenly, and the first thing he did was write down what had happened to him, that he remembered standing on the wall, hearing 4 shots, feeling one enter his head, falling off the wall, being dragged away from it, and being beaten. He'd been awake about 3 days when I came in, and his father was, of course, very, very happy that he'd woken up. And he said to him, "Suhaib, speak to Heather in English and show her how well you can speak English." And he turned to me and took me by the hand and looked me right in the eye and said in English, "There is no God. I've been there, and he rejected me, and now I reject him." And this is the way he was speaking the first few days. But he did cheer up, and this last drawing I did of him, he was feeling better, and he was saying, "There is a God, and I thank God, and I thank the doctors that saved my life." He was lying on a flag that his mother had made for him, and he wanted me to color it in the drawing, and I didn't have my colors, so I went off to get them, and I left the drawing with him and asked him to write on it, because he was doing all this strange writing. But when I came back, he was asleep, and his father had written on it. But it's a nice message. It says, "From the injured of the Intifada to the children of the free world, our greetings to you. We will meet when the occupation is over in our land of Palestine." And I was feeling pretty good about Suhaib waking up and some of the other children getting better, and just that I'd finished what I wanted to do. I'd made 298 drawings, and I was ready to go home. And just for my own sake, I wanted to make 300, so the night before I left, I went back into Makassar to make the last 2 drawings. And these are the last 2 drawings that I made. This was on the intensive care ward, and the staff didn't know this boy's name or what had happened to him, except that it had something to do with some settlers and something to do with the army in Nablus. And he'd been in a jail cell for 3 or 4 hours, and they figured the soldiers just thought that he was dead, and then somebody happened to look in and notice that he was alive, so they brought him into the hospital. But all the long bones in his arms and legs were fractured. And making these last drawings really changed the whole work for me. It made me realize that just because I was finished and leaving didn't mean anything at all, that this is going on, and this is actually getting a lot worse. But this is what I have to show you, and I think it's the extent of the violence against the children that is so incredible. 200 have been killed, and between 50,000 and 63,000 children under 16 years old have been injured deliberately, badly enough to be hospitalized within the last 2 years. There are soldiers who refuse to do this, so it's a question of choice also, and it's a question of human rights. And that crosses all borders. But what I want is to witness to the individual children so that you will understand this struggle in human terms, now that you've seen a very few of them face to face.